Well, thank you all for coming to the faculty forum. Hope you caught that. This forum is actually a preview of a book signing, which Jean and Amy are going to do next spring, so that the third author who used to teach at Wagner can also be here. So, but in any case, the book is circulating, and before I introduce the two authors here, just that it is Seeing White, an Introduction to White Privilege and Race, and we'll probably have a chance to look at it. Jean is Associate Professor of Sociology, as most of you know, but maybe some of the students don't know. She has her degrees were all in slightly different things, which I think is interesting. She has a BA from Colorado College in psychology, and master's in religious studies from Harvard, and a PhD in sociology, which is her official field now, from the CUNY Graduate School. And she has a previous book, at least one, Boundaries of Touch, Parenting and Adult Intimacy, from 2007. And I won't go into all the others. It's sort of a prominent book. Amy, on the other hand, is all psychology. Her bachelor's from Hope College and her master's and PhD from the University of Kansas. And they also, just incidentally, have done an awful lot of collaborative work in teaching an ILC on violence and aggression. And so this book is definitely sort of a culmination of a very extensive collaborative relationship. So I will give the floor over to them.
Thank you so much. That was really nice. So thank you all very much for coming. I know this is like the beginning of the craziest part of the semester, and we're really grateful that you took the time to come and be with us. We're going to go back and forth, which is sort of what we did in the book, and so I'll say a bit and Amy will say a bit, and we'll probably talk too long. So interrupt with questions or tell us to stop whenever necessary. I want to start by telling you we had intellectual reasons for writing the book, but the truth is that I just wanted to spend more time with Amy. So I suggested that we write a book. And it worked. I got to spend a lot of time with Amy. So now I have to come up with another book. But our idea came from a class that we teach for the first year program, which is our reflective tutorial class. It's on race, class, gender, and sexuality. And so we were, getting used to exploring race with students here at Wagner College, first-year students, wonderfully kind and interesting and engaged students, but students who didn't really see race as their issue and would ask questions like, what does this have to do with me when we explore race in the classroom? They could understand gender. They could understand, to some extent, socioeconomic class and sexuality, but in a predominantly white classroom, like many of our classrooms are at Wagner, they didn't see race as their issue.
So before teaching with Jean, I had been using Peggy McIntosh's piece, which was one of the first pieces on white privilege. And I'd used it a number of times. Actually, and if I could get one back, I should have kept one for my phone. I'd used it a number of times in a psychology of gender class that I taught in the 2 years before Jean joined the faculty. And I found within a psychology of gender class that students were really excited to talk about this piece. So McIntosh, as a white woman from gender studies, from women's studies, started to notice from recognizing the ways that she was disadvantaged as a woman, started to get a connection of, wait, how am I advantaged as a white person, and getting frustrated with interacting with male faculty who weren't recognizing their own advantage, and really spending some time unpacking her own list of advantages. And she makes this argument in the article we just handed out to you that privilege is like an invisible knapsack that weighs nothing, that she has all of these advantages that she carries around with her every single day without even noticing them. And I had used this piece a couple of times before teaching with Jean, and I often found, so I highlighted number 21 and 26, I often found that when I first ask the students, so what did you think of the Macintosh piece? Hands would come up, students would feel really passionate, and they'd start to try to pick this apart because they really wanted to resist this argument. They really wanted to show, no, Macintosh is wrong. And I've seen, number 26, I've seen Band-Aids that come in lots of different colors, so Macintosh is therefore completely wrong. And so Jean and I had started teaching this course on race, class, and gender. The Macintosh piece was actually in the anthology that we were using at that time in the book. And I said to them, so what did you think of Macintosh? And as I expected, the hands shot up. And I said, okay, what do you want to talk about? And one of the students said, number 17. And so I said, okay, do you want to read number 17? And the student said, I can criticize our government and talk about how much I fear its policies and behavior without being seen as a cultural outsider. And I was expecting the student to try to tell me how Macintosh was wrong. And I said, okay, because I didn't expect number 17. I expected number 26, right? One of the two that I put a triangle around rather than a circle. And so I said, well, what do you want to say about that? That is so true, the student said. This piece is so insightful. And I was like, whoa, what's happening here? Oh, okay, all right. And then the next student said, I want to talk about number 19. That is so true. And I was reeling because I was ready to defend Macintosh. I was ready to challenge them to think critically about Macintosh. And I couldn't figure out what had changed. Well, I'm a social psychologist, and the power of the situation is incredibly important. What context were they reading this in? Well, before I had taught with Jean, I used Macintosh as a way of introducing the topic of race in my class. But with Jean, the students had already been exposed to racism isn't individual bigotry. It's institutionalized in our culture. It's often without intention that it occurs. And suddenly I realized, okay, Macintosh really works in a very different way, in a different context. And it was exciting to think about how could we make sure that we first expose students to racism not as individual bigotry, but as institutionalized, and then maybe really have a much more productive conversation about it.
So that was an exciting moment when we began to see that our students were really beginning to understand the nature of racism in some profound way in our contemporary United States. Yet there was still something missing. They saw more and more the depth of the problem and the extent of the harm done, yet they continued to see the problem as someone else's problem. That is, the predominantly white students that we had in our learning community and continue to have. It was something that happened to someone else, that harmed someone else, and that mattered to someone else. And they could be concerned, but it wasn't their issue. So for example, one of our papers we used for our reflective tutorial asked students to explore race from the perspective of their own lives and to think about race from the perspective of what their experiences are and to kind of push against another character. And we use different books at different times as our interlocutor with the topic. But we asked them to really do an autobiographical piece largely. And students again and again, white students again and again would say, well, I don't really have anything to say about this. This isn't, there's nothing for me in this. I'm just a person. I'm just normal. I mean, sometimes they'd add boring, right? But normal. They're humans. So this is where we began to see the need to explore privilege in a more depthful way and to help students see that being white obviously is a race, right? Something we all know and are well aware of. But not only is it a race, it's a race that benefits from a racist system. And so in our book we argue that we live in a racist society, that the racism is institutional and profound and deeply harmful. We argue that racism is socially constructed, not biological, and yet that it still matters, that students can't use that as an excuse to not talk about it. It's not biological, so it's not real, and we're done. We wanted students to begin to see that they actually, the white students in our classrooms, benefit from how race happens. So Amy was really great as we started to explore the terms we were going to use in our book, terms like racism. Amy kept Rania and I on task in terms of really carefully defining terms. And Rami and I were both a little bit like, Amy, come on. That wasn't, we wanted to get into the, to the writing, and we wanted to kind of go with our thinking. And she was so on track to kind of force us to pull back and be very careful and very intentional about what each term meant.
And my thinking on that is, if I clearly define for you, by racism, I mean not just prejudice, but prejudice with power behind it. And that whites have power in the United States, and so only whites can be racist. And so that was originally a definition of racism that came from Patricia Badal, who was in education she was actually working as a superintendent and came up with that definition. It's been adopted by a number of social scientists, including Beverly Daniel Tatum, who's now at Spelman College, the president of Spelman. And that definition, I remember first being exposed to it and not liking it. Because only white people, and that's me, right? And that definition just called me racist. And other people don't have to have that terrible term that feels like a slap in the face. And I remember the first time I read that definition, and I remember resisting it and really feeling challenged to think, challenged to push back. Whereas if we just sort of talk about racism, maybe we can say, well, it's somebody else's issue. And so really wanting to define terms and seeing the definition of terms as a way of inviting an argument. So Beverly Daniel Tatum, in her book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations on Race, she says, these are the ways I'm defining these terms. And as long as you understand where I'm coming from, we can agree to disagree. And what's fascinating to me is when I've used that book in classes, students often really hate when she first defines those terms. And then by the end of the semester, as they're reviewing for their final exam, they realize exactly where she's coming from. And so we're hoping to get a strong reaction from students to say, this is where we're coming from, and push against us, disagree with us, and tell us why.
So we'd like to just note that we use a theoretical structure in our book that is often used in sociology and anthropology and other disciplines as well, and that is the idea of cultural materialism, which really goes back to Karl Marx. I'm sure many of you have used and thought about this idea, and that is that the ways we think about the cultural forms, the ideologies of a particular society in a given moment and place are born out of a political economic way in which we live. So that the ways in which we build and reproduce our lives feed our thinking, and then the thinking comes back around and reproduces the ways that we live. So we use as an example right at the beginning of our book, and we're rather loose with the history, but we talk about feudalism and how in feudal societies in Europe, people thought of themselves as fitting into a hierarchical structure that was bound by nature. So if you were a peasant in feudal Europe, it was like being a cow. You were a peasant forever and always. You didn't think about becoming a horse someday. There was none of the sort of individualist ideology that we have now, where everybody thinks, if only I try hard enough, I can be something else. That was, was absolutely not the frame of thought that people held. And so we discuss that, and we think about how that way of thinking was obviously profoundly beneficial to some. So within the structure, there's very few elites at the top, and those are the aristocracy and the Catholic Church supporting the aristocracy. They held social and economic power through force, ultimately. But because of this way of thinking that kind of came out of this political economic structure, peasants didn't tend to challenge the system. You were a peasant, you were always a peasant, that's what you were. So we think about that as a profound contrast from what a common mainstream ideology is in the US, and that is the idea of individualism. And we help our students to see how that's an example of cultural materialism, or it can be used to explain cultural materialism, and that is that people's way of thinking, again, come out of the political economic structures and ways that they live. So we use that in our book, and it adds a frame, a theoretical frame, to the rest of the story.
And so it was really fun and dynamic to work with Jean and Ramya Vijaya, an economist, to think about what are the pieces that we want to definitely get in. So for me, teaching is very much about storytelling, and there's some fantastic stories from my field. And then how can we weave these different perspectives together? And what are some things that we absolutely need to make sure that we get in there, and who takes those pieces. So one of the things that we wanted to make sure to do was to explain to students what it means that race is socially constructed, that it's not actually rooted in biology. And I had heard this argument so many times, and I knew that there was some really great data. And to be honest, one of the first times I talked about race in a class when I was a graduate student at the University of Kansas, one of my students said, "I'm in anthropology," and then he took over the next 15 minutes of class, and I was like, "Thank you." I was excited to tackle this chapter because I knew I wanted to know more about this. I knew that the evidence was there, the arguments were there. And I'm very thankful to Celeste Gaillon and Alexa Dietrich for really pointing out, and I think, so all I've read of anthropology is the very best pieces that two of our colleagues would point out. So as far as I'm concerned, anthropology is just perfect. I have anthropology envy at this point in my life. But just to start to look at the unpacking of the evidence, and for me as an empiricist, to be able to play with, how can I take Lewontin's work where he shows that it doesn't make sense to try to group people into this race and then distinctly differently this race, that there's a continuum of humanity and we don't easily break into different groups. And if you try to lay skin color on top of shape of the eyes, on top of hair texture, you end up just getting this mishmash that makes no sense whatsoever. And so for me, being able to teach a bit about research methodology by using one study and unpacking how he's defining variables, being able to tell people this is what a variable is one of my most exciting things. And so being able to unpack that and play with that and really think about ways that, even though I was learning something new as I was trying to explain this to students, to use my area of expertise to play with that was really exciting.
So to help students understand this idea of social construction, we use a number of examples, one of which is really, our chapter on race is not biology, where we use science as a way of thinking that's born out of a system that benefits some and harms others, and we critique that way of thinking in terms of the issue of race. So that becomes an example of the social construction, or the making of ideas that are born out of ways of living that those in power benefit from. We also use a really terrific book, a memoir written by Gregory Howard Williams that some of you may have seen. It's his own memoir. He was actually, I think he's in the sciences. I think he's a biologist, he's a mathematician, I can't remember, but he's an academic like us, and in his 50s decided to go back and write about his childhood story, which is a pretty interesting story. He lived in the 40s and 50s in the South. He was a white boy. His parents were working class, but they owned a bar. They were sort of on the borderline between working and middle class, and they ran the bar themselves. And in the South at that time, of course, there was, institutionalized segregation, such that their bar had an area for white people, which was the much nicer area, and an area for African Americans, which was the sort of the crummy area. And they had some African American workers that had stayed in their carefully policed regions of the space. And he grew up that way as a white boy living in this highly racist society until he was 10. And at that time, his mother decided to leave his alcoholic and abusive father. She took the two youngest children and left him and his brother with the father. And at that time, everything else fell apart as well. The bar just sort of went under financially, and they couldn't make ends meet, and things became a mess. So pretty quickly, his father decided that he had to take the two sons and move north to Muncie, Indiana, which is an interesting place for me to read about because, of course, sociologists talk about Muncie a lot. It's Middletown, one of our famous books written by Lind and Lind in the 20s, and then they did another issue later, I think in the 60s, where they explored this sort of middle town, right, and examined American life and American culture within this average, run-of-the-mill, normal town. And of course what they looked at was the white community, and they really spend almost, I think I counted 2 lines that address the African American community in the book. So this man is riding the bus back to Muncie, where he's from, and his father, a boy, he's 10, his father discloses that actually he's black, and that the father had been passing all that time in the South as a Southern Italian person, immigrant. So he's stunned. He knew all about race from the perspective of a white person, and that pretty much just meant that he wasn't black and that he didn't have to, he could go anywhere. Everything was open to him. So suddenly, he was going to be the one that was on the other side of that line. And the rest of the text is essentially a story of him going back to live in the black community from where his father came. And his father going back home meant he had to come out as someone who had been passing, because of course everybody in his hometown knew who he was. And this man, Gregory Howard Williams' experience is just radically different all of a sudden. So it's, he's living in poverty, he's the best student in his grade at his junior high and high school, but he's never, given credit for that. He's the best athlete as well, basketball and football, never given credit for that, always kept on the side, can't go to a lot of areas of the town. And as it turned out, his mother was white, but that family completely disowned her and her children. So they wouldn't, he had been visiting the town as a white boy and living with his white grandparents through his childhood in the summer, but now they wouldn't have anything to do with him, now that he was on the black side of town. So it's a really powerful story that allows, so you enter into the story as a white person, those of us who are white, enter into the story identifying with this white boy and his experience in the South, and all of a sudden you're just completely thrown because you were the white boy, and then now you have to follow him into this place you've never been. And students find it, I think, really moving and compelling. So that's one example we use. And we try, as Amy said, to do a lot of storytelling in the book. We really want to help students to, well, one, we want to be engaging. We want them to be interested and to stick with it. But we also want people to get some taste of the sort of rich, interpretive experience of life that humans have. And particularly around this issue, which is, I think, in many ways, a heartbreaking issue. So the next story we explore in our social construction chapter is we examine Noel Ignatieff and David Roediger's books about how the Irish became white. So some of you have probably read some of that material, and we were lucky because my stepmother, who just passed away, was good friends with David Roediger, so we even were connected to him, and that was very helpful. And we used their work, and they're terrific, and did some really interesting things where they began to explore the ways in which people like the Irish, and I'm Irish American myself, and a lot of our students are Irish American, actually, went through a profound shift. And I know we all know this, but often our students don't. That when my family immigrated, potato famine time, we were potato famine, Irish Catholic, and then later waves of Irish came. Most of them were around the potato famine. That immigration happened such that they really weren't white. They were another race. And there's all kinds of, Roediger and Ignatieff really, we just use their research, but there's all kinds of literature on that. And in fact, the Irish were actually pretty connected to free African Americans in the northern areas of the United States. Often lived in this, like Philadelphia, there were whole neighborhoods that were very mixed, churches that were very mixed, people, intermarried and had children together and built lives together. And what Roediger explores, as many of you probably know, is the ways in which the white working class, including those Irish, soon-to-be American immigrants, began to distance themselves from African Americans as a way to gain a kind of psychological wage, that's what he calls it, and he gets that from W.E.B. Du Bois, a psychological wage of whiteness. And that is, they may, as the working class, not gain other things by separating themselves from people of color, but they do gain a sense of power and privilege just by the fact of this whiteness. And so Roediger argues that's why the white working class shot themselves in the foot and became profoundly racist in all of their organizing, because it actually benefited them in this other way. Whereas it would have been better to organize with everyone across this ethnic and racial spectrum in terms of actual power that they would have had. They made another choice, and Roediger claims that that's the reason. So we use those as examples of the ways in which whiteness has happened and is socially constructed in the U.S.
So, as many social scientists do, I think I'm similar to many, I love analyzing the problem and really trying to pull out all this evidence that shows, look at the problem. And I've discovered from teaching students that it's really depressing to spend 12 weeks looking at the problem, maybe 12 and a half weeks, or I often like to teach 3-day-a-week classes, so maybe 12 and 2/3 weeks looking at the problem, and then maybe a little something at the end of the semester of, well, maybe we could do this. And I discovered, again by chance, again through choosing material in a class that I didn't choose intentionally to give them glimmers of hope throughout the semester, but I was teaching Psychology of Prejudice with a new text, and they tried to pull in not easy solutions, not feel good, but not effective solutions, but possibly effective, probably very difficult to achieve, solutions throughout the semester. And I just found that students didn't get so overwhelmed by the gravity of the problem, but really saw some glimmers of hope. And so that was another thing that I sort of pushed for in the book. I wanted, like, let's not give easy ideas, but let's give some really challenging ones, and let's also pull in some of the exciting research that's been done around ideas that might work. And one that I'm just really excited about and wanted to share with you today is that developing an identity that we share. And so Sam Gertner and John DeVideo have this concept of a common in-group identity. If we really see ourselves as part of a we with others, that can be really quite powerful. And this also gives me a chance in the book to describe a social psychological study, which is another one of my favorite things to do. So for me, for Jean, it was like, how do we make writing really social? Because Jean's incredibly prolific in her writing. And for me, it was, okay, how do I tell the stories that I want to make sure, and how do I owe myself to these co-writers so that I'll actually get some writing done, which is a challenge for me. And so one of the things that we get to do in there is to really unpack some of the evidence. And so I love describing these laboratory studies that maybe have really low realism in terms of everyday things, what we refer to as mundane realism, but really sort of get at a psychological issue that's of interest. And so, one thing that's just so powerful to think about, Gertner, DeVideo, and a number of colleagues did some research where they had people from Psych 101 showed up in the lab, and they either were working independently on a project where they had to decide how do you rank order different things, and they were told, we'll compare your answers. So you're in the winter survival condition, and you have these 10 items, and you have to rank order which of them are you going to carry. You've just had a plane crash, and you've survived the plane crash. It's a little like Lost, but without the whole metaphysical stuff that was going on there, right? And so, rank order these items in terms of how important they'll be for your survival in this winter place after this crash. And so some people worked on it independently, and then they were asked, all right, so the women that are around you, so in this study they had women doing it, the women that are around you, what do you think about them and their answers? So each woman in the individual condition came up with her own answer and then read it into a video camera and watched the other women read it as well. And so each of these women were either with a woman who was actually planted in the situation to follow a script, and she was either an African American woman or another white American woman, and the participants were all white American women. So in that condition, they kind of, not very much of a difference, but kind of preferred the white woman, those who saw the white woman, to how the African American woman was rated. But if they brought them into the lab and said, all right, you're a team, and here's your team name, and we're all Delaware students, and we're going to wear Delaware t-shirts while we do this study, and they all wore identical Delaware t-shirts, and your answers are going to be compared against the University of Maryland's answers, and they're our outgroup, and we don't like them. And so as a team, you have to come up with the best answers you possibly can, and that's going to be compared. And you have to come to consensus with each other. You're going to sit at the same table. You're going to work on this. They found that, again, these women, the African American woman and the white American woman, were following a script that was given, but suddenly working with an African American partner, the argument is that to have this sense of we-ness with someone that maybe you would often not feel a real connection with can be kind of enhanced and heightened. And so they had this extra connection. And so in social psychology, if we can do a line graph and the lines cross each other, it's really exciting, and that's called an interaction. And so they've got this gorgeous graph, and the lines are crossing right over. And so the African American woman is perceived dramatically differently, the same woman, across different people, if she's part of my team than if she's just this other woman sitting at another table near me. And thinking about, how can we harness that in different ways? How can we try to give a sense of connection. Now, I do feel bad for the University of Maryland folks, right? So these are Delaware students against Maryland students, so it is problematic that you sort of need an out-group in order to get this we feeling, but maybe thinking about ways, how can we construct we feelings across racial lines? And how can we try to create that? And so, maybe having it be, we're LC11, right? As our students might say, might be a way of really creating a sense of connection where they could really get to know each other, especially if we have them working closely together, and not having these feelings of racial distinction between them.
So as a sociologist, I was always more interested in structural issues. So that was a tension that I think was great in the book. And in terms of that issue, Ramya and I were on the same line. She's an economist, and so we came very focused on structure and the ways in which institutions reproduce racism and race in the United States. So I feel like that's another way in which, working together, the three of us, we ended up with this very diverse and, interdisciplinary, obviously, book that addresses these issues from a whole variety of perspectives and makes it, interesting in that way. Ramya and I were interested in talking about a couple of policy and also social movements that we feel like, are just examples of things that could be supported to achieve a more fair society, a less oppressive society. And Ramya wrote in particular about the living wage movement, which you may have heard of. It started, actually college students started it, I think, at Vanderbilt. And what they realized was that the support staff and the custodians and the people digging, to plant things outside in the lawn were not making a wage that they could live on. So people were working full time and they didn't make enough to pay their rent or get healthy food that they needed or get health care necessarily, depending on the benefits situation. And the students were shocked. I mean, I think that's another myth, along with the individualism myth, and that is if you're working 40 hours, you're going to make a living. So if you're not making a living, you're not working 40 hours. And students are, continuously surprised to find out, well, actually, lots of people work a lot more than 40 hours and still don't make a living. So these students discovered that and started this movement where they began to argue for institutions, and the ones that they were actually influential in, like their school, beginning to pay a living wage. And that movement has taken off, in sprinkles around the country. So that's something we wanted to be sure to talk about and offer as a kind of hope that there are movements that students can put themselves behind and really push it forward and support. Another example, I insisted that we discuss the guaranteed income, and it was actually a point of contention between Ramya and I. She felt like, well, it's going to discredit the book because we're at a moment where people are not going to be willing to think about the guaranteed income, but we ended up coming around and deciding to do it. And many of you, I'm sure, have heard of the guaranteed income movement, but for those who haven't, it's come up on again, off again over the last couple centuries, really, in the United States. And it's a movement where it would be a policy where everybody would get a guaranteed income. It would be an equal income, and everybody across the board would get it. Poor, rich, everybody would get an income, and it would come from our tax dollars. So, for me, as a way to structurally make things better, to get people on a more even footing, I feel like that's just another small step that we could take. It sounds large, but it's a small step that would give people access to resources and power where then, we don't have to be talking about white people addressing their own individual racism, which is clearly a good thing to do, but people of color can actually move into the neighborhoods that they've been segregated out of and go to the schools that they've been separated from and have access to the resources that they simply, many do not have access to in the United States today. I mean, that's another issue we discuss, and that is how profoundly segregated the United States is. So the guaranteed income movement, I love to note, was actually something that almost happened under Richard Nixon, a Republican. He was behind that movement, proposed it and pushed for it. And it didn't happen then, but it's something that conceivably could happen at some point. So those are some of the more structural and social policy ideas, social movement ideas that Ramya and I brought.
And one thing that was really exciting was, as we were writing, to think about, who is our audience and how do we explain the guaranteed income to, and really we were sort of thinking 18-year-olds as our audience, and so really describing that this is a safety net that's in place, and then people can work hard, and there could still be wealthy people under this system, and everyone wouldn't be making the exact same, but everyone would get the same, and then be able to work from that. And so really thinking about how to structure this and explain it.
And you, Amy, had a really great idea that hadn't occurred to me in writing that section, and that is to talk about it in terms of public education, which of course is like a guaranteed income. It's a guaranteed education for everyone. Now we know it's not equal, but that's a pretty profound and fairly recent policy in U.S. and global history. So we compared it to that because that's something most students, it's like talking about feminism and saying that one of the early movements was that women have the vote. Well, suddenly everyone's a feminist, right? Because most people in the room think women should have the vote. So that was a great idea. Yeah. So we'd like to open up now for questions and conversation with you, if you have anything you'd like to know more about or challenge or whatnot.
A challenge that I have constantly, and I talk about, I use the NASDAQ article in a couple of different classes, and especially in counseling, talking about race. I spend a couple of weeks talking about cross-cultural, multicultural counseling. It's so awkward and it's so difficult to do when you have one student of color in the class, or even two students of color in the classes. So often that's the case. What advice can you lend?
Well, this was an issue we grappled with in our class as well. The first time we taught together, and I do a lot on race. I mean, American Studies is my area in sociology, and it's really a big focus of that kind of cultural studies, as it's called, is race, and in particular African American lives, and history is an area of mine. So coming to a school like Wagner, I had been teaching in the CUNY system, where there was diversity in the classroom, and there was a lot of opportunity for all kinds of perspectives to exist. But here, our first time we taught the race, class, gender, sexuality course, we had one African American in our classroom, and it was clear that we were doing a profound disservice to that student to teach this course with him alone in the room like that. Because in part what happens, is that a lot of racism comes out, because there is a lot of racism out there, right? And so here he was by himself facing that. So we've insisted, and I don't know how much of a help this is really to everybody, but we've insisted that we need to have a sizable number of students of color in our classrooms. That's one thing. If you're going to do race, that we have more, and that's why we really need to push for diversity, right? And I know we're all on board about that, but it's profoundly important. I mean, it just makes a better education for everyone as a bottom line. And then we also hoped that our book would act as a support to students of color in the classroom. And so far, that's what we're finding. Do you want to say a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing, just this issue of being solo, being the only person, or token, being, so I think in a larger group, 15% or less of the group, there's a lot of research out there in psychology about how much a person can feel like they stick out, that solo women in leadership training in the military end up being harmed by, there's all this ambiguity, and so someone's not always strong or always weak, and they found that in systematically looking at groups that they had created, women who were solo in a 6-person leadership group would over time be rated worse and worse and worse, but women where there were a couple of different women, so the men weren't just saying, oh look, yeah, I have this stereotype that women aren't good, and there's that one piece of evidence, right? She mentioned the Band-Aid, right? Like, it's picking it apart the way students used to pick apart Macintosh's piece. And so part of that can be acknowledging, that in our classroom, just saying this could be, maybe first pulling aside and saying, I'd like to meet with these students and say, we're going to be talking about these things, and I want to sort of let you know I'm going to talk about that this is awkward, because it's awkward for the white students too. I can remember with that first group, the white students felt bad for the student of color every time, and they wanted to have some connection, and so really sort of thinking about maybe looking for a common identity of, we are the counseling psychology group, and as that, this is what we have in common, and so maybe doing some we feeling exercises before getting to that, so that people are seeing it not as the man who's African American in the group, but as Joe. And so maybe that would be helpful.
And just as a final note, I found it really helpful to bring in speakers of color, because I'm white and I do a lot on race, to actually have a diversity of speakers, which is another reason why we need more diversity in our faculty. But I think it can be empowering for a student of color to have. Yeah.
just want to respond to, I think you bring up a really good point, Steve, and when you asked the question, I leaned over and said to John, I hear what Steve says, and when I'm in that situation and I'm the professor as a black woman, it's a very different dynamic. So I taught classes and seminars, and there's 1 or 2 African American students and maybe 10 white students, and it's a very different dynamic. First of all, the African American students feel kind of like they have an ally. The professor's talking about it, and the professor's okay with this, and so it's legitimate, and so on. So I think that differential really makes a difference, and it's really in line with what you're saying, Jean. But I also think back to the clinical and counseling and psychology research that shows when you look at the experiences of African American clients in therapy, even more important than race is feeling a connection and feeling that their therapist is credible and really hears them. So, you know, there's that tension, yes, and yes at the same time, promoting that we-ness and having, I think, having exercises and exploring each person's own identity, ethnic identity, to see how it's all there. When we talk about race and ethnicity, we're not just talking about being black. We're talking about all the other variations because it impacts everything we do, whether it's in therapy or whatever.
We actually, that makes me think of a lecture that Celeste just gave in our classroom where she, I mean, you could speak about it obviously much better than me, but I feel like that offered an opportunity for students to begin to see how much diversity there is and how unfounded our ideas about biology are. It's a terrific lecture, so let me promote that you exploit Celeste by putting her into your classes, but it was, you know.
Well, and sort of going on that, one of the things I would say too is that, and this probably has come up with you guys in your class explicitly, is that, and thinking back to the passing, right, the man who's passing, is that we look out in our class and we think that we see a certain amount of diversity, and the other students think that they see a certain amount of diversity, but actually having a conversation about what the diversity exists in the classroom. Where are people from? What do they self-identify? What is their identity? And you might actually find that that students that people would think were white, well actually they identify themselves as something else, as some other race, as some other variety, and so there might in fact be more diversity in the room than we expect. Of course, when you open up that can, it might be full of worms. There might actually be, everyone might self-identify as a white person and there is no more diversity in the room, which might give you the opportunity to talk about ethnicity or class or some other avenue of diversity. And that's another possibility, because part of it is that we expect that everyone has the same image in their mind of what these different classifications are, except for that we don't. So it's another possibility.
I have 2 questions. The first is, and it's more, I guess, the afterthought of the class. What have you seen? Have you seen your students behave and actually act differently, whether in their lives or after class, or after that semester, on Wagner's campus or in their own lives? Have you seen that difference? And then also, I feel like I haven't finished. I've been reading through the book, and the we part that you just mentioned is really, I've been thinking about it a lot, and it almost, at Wagner we haven't had that we, I mean, who here has heard of Seahawk Pride? I mean, you don't have many of those moments where Wagner students or maybe the whole community come together, and so you have NSU on its own as its own black or minority we, and there's recently been a lot of struggles about bringing a traditionally black sorority or fraternity to campus and like all these things. So have you seen that difference, and then what are ways, or what would you suggest to the community about ways that we can create that we to help begin to change it institutionally here?
All right, I'm gonna totally put Neil and Amanda on the spot right now as people who have, so Neil was in our first year program and Amanda took Psychology of Prejudice with me, and I'm just curious, do you feel like your thinking has changed or your actions have changed?
I would definitely say for me it was like a firework had gone off, I would say, for me, and just my way of thinking and going forth and terminology I would use and just everything I would say impacted me on a day-to-day basis after the first year program. And it's something that still really interests me, and I had been interested in going into psychology, sociology, and then / arts admin. I really had a struggle deciding, and I went with arts admin, but it's still something I really, really think about, and my first semester experience is something that really, really impacted me here at Wagner, and just something I always think of.
And so I don't think we're gonna get, Neil is an unusually fantastic person to have the opportunity to work with, so I don't think everybody's gonna have Neil's experience, but for some students, I do think that we see students coming back and, you know, like from their first paper to often, you know, if I get the chance to see them as sophomores or juniors, and of course they're self-selecting in, they really like the social sciences, they're coming back for another class with me, but sometimes I'm sort of surprised at the topics that they might choose in a later class, or the classes that they might be interested in. Amanda, do you want to say anything? You don't have to.
I guess likewise, my thinking process, I feel like it's changed. I feel like after taking Psych Prejudice with you, it was an ILC with
Right, so you were in another American Diversity course with Jean at the same time.
I've definitely become more sensitive to these topics and more interested in them. So, did that answer the question?
So, and then what can we do to create a we feeling at Wagner was your second question. And it's really interesting because, I mean, so I'm hearing little things that are happening, like the candle lighting ceremony didn't exist when I came to Wagner, but now that's part of orientation. So what sort of efforts do you see, Kevin, and what do you think might work better?
I don't know, there's been various throughout the time. So I mean, Bridge the Gap was something recently that started to happen that I guess was more inclusive and kind of drew also upon different boundaries, not just theater and athletes. There were some other things there as well. There's the Erase the Hate, so this is the second time we're doing it, this becoming an institutional, traditional thing every year. 2 years ago we had started a candlelight vigil in response to commemorate some of the protests that happened in the 70s that I think we're trying to do again this year. But like, I have seen Wagner change in the last 2.5 years, but I do feel that there's still, that there hasn't been enough, and it's always coming from, I mean, and this is my own bias because I'm in these circles, like, it's always coming from the same places. And so it's, you know, it's the minorities writing, saying, we need to do this, and so we're going to do it, or it's the, you know, LGBT identifying students saying, we need to do more of this, and you're not having it come the other way, and sometimes you're not having it also, it's starting to come institutionally, but it's been very slow in my opinion. And that's what I'm really interested in, is so you're not having the reactionary from the people feeling oppressed, but rather the oppressors recognizing that and beginning to do something else.
What you're saying, and also something that Selma said, is making me think of an additional piece, and that is the issue of how much diversity there actually is. So sometimes,
of course.
I mean, and I think that can be, as teachers, that can be navigated or can be played with and used. So for example, I consider myself queer, identify as queer, I'm bisexual, and I'll bring that out sometimes in the classroom, and that'll, I mean, it has to be done carefully because it can sort of, you know, for some students it's like a bomb goes off and everybody's like, they think I'm going to take my shirt off and say, but when I finessed it well, it's actually worked well to help students see there are multiple ways in which we don't fit, that we're not normative in that room, and that can stir up the conversation a little bit, shift the conversation. And so I think a piece of what's important with the we is recognizing that the we holds a lot of diversity in it, that there's difference. And we can't be a we where we're all pretending we're all the same, but a we where we recognize that difference and stay together in it.
Neil, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say kind of what Kevin said. A lot of the groups that have been formed on campus, like the acting and athlete group, a lot of the LGBT things. I think a lot of these things coming up on campus almost reinforce the fact that not a lot of people see race as their problem. And because I really feel like your LC is probably one of the very few places on this campus where race is talked about openly and honestly. A lot of people view it as it's almost too large to talk about, and that it's not their problem, whereas LGBT things might be easier to talk about or more predominant on campus maybe. So I think that is another food for thought.
I think so.
Well, I just wanted, you know, if we're talking openly about race here, I wanted to bring up the I would like to know how many African American students do we have that are not athletes? Because many of them are athletes, and then they tend to focus more on sports than on academics, and we all know that. And, for some of us it is difficult to somehow erase that idea, okay, I have an athlete, and he's an African American, and he, most of the time is not gonna be a good student. And especially for freshman students, I don't know, maybe I can look around the room, and maybe you have had these type of students that you go like, we have not thought about that enough. And every time we talk about it, it's like, well, yeah, but I think it's a huge issue. I mean, we were talking about the Academic Honesty Committee. I became part of that committee. Then I decided not to be part of it because I could not be in there anymore. And then I saw 3 or 4 athletes that were African American, and I said, we have an issue here, and we're just not looking at it, and we're not recognizing it.
I mean, the hidden issue too is socioeconomic class. Because
Right,
of
of
course,
course.
those athletes, especially male athletes,
Right.
tend to be coming in and they're working class to working poor.
Right,
They haven't had a good education.
Right,
Most
exactly.
of them, they haven't had access to that, and they certainly can't get one here when they're working so hard at football and basketball. It just makes me crazy because they know there's cultural materialism, they know where the money's coming from, and they know what they need to do to be here and stay
Right.
here. And
Right.
so not only did they come in behind, but they never really have the opportunity, the support to catch up. And I agree with you, I think it's a huge issue.
But, and that doesn't apply only to the African-American students. I mean,
Yeah.
we've got half the student body are athletes, and many of those are here to play ball.
Yeah. And I think it's a particular issue for whatever reason with male athletes in a couple different sports. And that's what the national data seems to show as well. It's really, female athletes, for a variety of reasons that people have thought about but aren't sure, tend to actually do pretty well academically. So there's a different whole set of things going on with that. But
Because I would just like to remind people that by a smidgen, our athletes do better academically than the student body as a whole. Now, that's not to discount what you said, but it's to say we have to distinguish between
Yeah,
different
but
groups of
Yeah,
athletes.
but what is
different
going
sports
on
into account.
in terms of race?
Right.
and if we
That
look at
is that is
particular-
the issue. It's not the whole, the number of athletes that we have, but among those athletes, what's going on with the African American athletes? I would like to know.
A particular,
Yes.
Because I think the female athletes pull the athletes' GPA
Yeah.
up.
Right,
So,
right.
I mean,
and the
separate from that.
athletes outside of those 3 sports.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's challenging to, for a big guy who's African American to walk into a classroom and assume everybody's gonna look at me and realize that I'm a football player because, he's worked so hard on the size of his body and he's been selected for the size of his body. And to know that he's got this stereotype.
Yeah.
And so, we talk about self-fulfilling prophecy in the book. We talk about some of Claude Steele's work on, so he's another place where we have a glimmer of hope, where he really identified students who were at risk, and instead of giving them remedial work, he really said, okay, we want to create leaders on campus at the University of Michigan out of you. And so really worked on creating a we feeling of having students who were athletes, students who were not athletes, working together on some projects, identifying some leadership things, and some things that maybe we could think about in terms of, we have Division I sports and we're recruiting these students, and how do we really create safety nets in place for them, and that's definitely a conversation that we need to be having.
I could see, I'm going to take a statement that's been made a lot of times and I'm going to turn it into a question. I can see a student taking your class, and when they're done with it, they say, there is a system out there that, disadvantages other people but not me. It's not my issue. And so now at this point, turning it into a question, why is it their issue?
So one thing that we address a little bit in the book is, to look at, for example, the work of Linda Brent, who wrote Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. So she wrote an autobiography of her experience in slavery. And the book is as much about how white women were in a horrifying position within the system of slavery, where their husbands were philandering, where they had very little power, and that white men had this really revolting amount of power that was corrupting to them. And so one thing that we try to do is to challenge students to recognize there are ways that whites actually are benefiting from the system, and they're also being harmed at the same time. And so to have a system, so one thing that we do try to do is to appeal to a sense of social justice. And I think this book is not going to appeal to everyone, that there are going to be people like the students that chose to come here today, and many of you, who are very committed to social justice, and there might be some who will just be like, oh good, I'm benefiting, so that's all I really care about. But I think, you know, we really find that many of our students want a just world, and they've been able to assume that things are much more just than they are before reading the book. And so we want to really sort of shake them up and also give them some reasons to be hopeful.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and then we should really continue the conversation over wine and hors d'oeuvres. Any last thoughts?
Yeah, on your definition of racism.
Which is not actually the only definition of racism I've ever published. But for this book, going with Beverly Daniel Tatum's definition was a good way to go.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's an interesting definition, and of course, in science, you're welcome to define terms as you please, if it functions within your process there. But I'm wondering about two things. First of all, why is it necessary to define it that way, given your purposes?
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, what do you do then with the other notion of racism that most people carry around with and you know, consider racism to exist in almost all minority groups around the world?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we really want to do is get students thinking about social power in the book, and by using this definition of racism, it challenges them right from the beginning to think about social power. We also want them thinking about racism as institutionalized rather than as individual bigotry. Now, as a social psychologist, I'm very interested in individual bigotry, but working with a sociologist and an economist, I really wanted to shift the focus onto issues of power and institutions. And then one thing that we do acknowledge is that we sort of push to our readers, if you try to jump to, but wait, this group's prejudiced against that group, that could be interesting, unless your purpose in doing that is to deflect from thinking about yourself. And so yes, that's an interesting problem, but right now, that's not the problem we're looking at.
I mean, we made choices that we felt would open up the book more for students. So I have questions about our decision to use that definition. I'm not sure about it. I wonder about it, but I think it made sense for the purpose. And you know, cultural materialism. Well, I'm really a Michel Foucault person, so I have another perspective. But cultural materialism I think works really well, and it's something I felt students could get a hold of and then challenge. They can challenge the book just like we can, and we want to continue to encourage that to happen.
And you do that in your classes, it sounds like. So this is a definition we're choosing, but it's not the only one.
Yeah.